Thank you very much. And indeed, seeing you all here is immensely gratifying. I'm sorry that so many of you had to stand, but I hope we can keep you engaged for the evening. Your Excellency Khalid bin Daj bin Khalifa, the President of the Bahrain Keraleeya Samajam, Mr. P.V. Radhakrishnapulla, Mr. Veerumani Secretary, my good friend Ravi DC, my publisher in Malayalam, Mr. Prakash of the Indian Embassy, other distinguished office holders of the BKS on stage, very distinguished members of the audience, ladies and gentlemen, or as we say in Malayalam, Sahodari Sahodaramare ellarkkum ente vinidamaya namaskaram. It really is wonderful to be here on the occasion of this first BKS DC Literary Festival and to inaugurate it on this occasion. In fact, I was struck by the fact that BKS is also a very common short form for books. So BKS DC is like Books DC, and I think it works very well for a literary festival name. Equally, books and the reading habit are indispensable to those of us who write, because there would be no writers if there were no readers. Writers write to be read, and it's a matter of great satisfaction when Ravi tells me that here in Bahrain, people are lapping up books despite their much higher price as a result of the transportation costs from India. So the fact that you are all reading is also a matter of great pride for us. I'm very touched by the presence here of Sheikh Khalifa. I had the pleasure, as he mentioned, of meeting him a couple of times, most recently when he was honored in Thiruvananthapuram by the people of the constituency, of my constituency, and particularly by the Bahrain Trivandrum returnees. And what was striking was his graciousness, his openness and receptivity to the occasion and to the people of Thiruvananthapuram. And today again, while I was apologizing for some of our more time-consuming activities, he was totally unbothered. He said, no, these are all familiar people to me. I think he sounds like a politician who would win a lot of votes if he contested from here, from all of you. If the Kerala voters could elect him, I'm sure that he would do very well. I also want to thank Ravi DC for having brought the book here. I don't know how many of you know this, but the Malayalam edition has not yet been released in Kerala. So what you've seen is actually the actual release of the Malayalam edition. The book An Era of Darkness was published a few months ago in English. It's now appeared in the UK as well, where, to my pleasant surprise, it has climbed to the #1 rank in the bestseller charts of the London Evening Standard. So the Brits are also reading it. But of course in India it has had a certain impact, and it was already mentioned to you, the particular factor that led to this was when I was invited to address an Oxford Union debate and made a speech on the inequities and depredations of British colonialism in India, which a couple of months later was loaded on YouTube by the Oxford Union organizers and then went viral. And since millions of people were watching it, my publisher called me and said, you have to turn this into a book. And I said, for God's sake, why bother? Everyone knows this already in India. And he said, no, they don't, because if they did know it already, your speech wouldn't have gone viral. So that convinced me that perhaps indeed there was a need to put together these arguments in one place once again for a modern generation. And that's what I've done. I have described in An Era of Darkness how the British came to what was the richest country in the world in 1700. In 1700, India accounted for 27% of global GDP. For comparison, today the United States is about 23% of global GDP. So India accounted for 27% of global GDP. The revenues of the Indian Emperor Aurangzeb in 1700 were more than those of all the crowned heads of Europe put together. So that includes King Louis and his palace in Versailles. It includes the Queen in Buckingham Palace, the whole lot of them. Their revenues collectively did not match what the Mughal Emperor could count upon. So that was the richness of India. And in the course of 250 years of British presence, 200 years of British rule, they managed to drain the resources of this rich country, and through a series of disastrous policies and deliberate loot, they reduced it to one of the poorest, most diseased, most illiterate countries in the world. The British left India in 1947 with a poverty line that accounted for 90% of the population were below the poverty line. The average life expectancy was 27. That is, the average person born in India could not expect to live beyond 27. The literacy rate was 17%. It was even worse for women because women were 8.9% literacy. And of course, infant mortality, child mortality, or landlessness, all sorts of things were widespread across the country, thanks to 200 years of British rule. 35 million people had lost their lives in famines created deliberately by British imperial policy. So when you look at all of this, you ask yourself, how is it that people today are so unaware of all that has happened? I often say to young people, why should you know about the past? Because if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? I'm not interested in focusing on history by dwelling in the past, particularly as a politician and a public figure. My interest is in the present and in the future of my country. And in India, in any case, we've had a long tradition of forgiveness. There is a story I recount in the book about Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India, being received by Winston Churchill in the mid-50s, and Churchill says to him, how is it that despite the fact that we forced you to spend 10 years of your life in jail, that you bear us no bitterness, no rancor? And Nehru is said to have replied, I was taught by a great man, Mahatma Gandhi, never to fear and never to hate. That is a fine virtue, because I think all of us who have read anything of Indian spiritual wisdom will confirm that hatred is a negative emotion, that forgiveness is good because the hater often hurts himself more than the object of his hatred. That negativity eats you up. So you should forgive. But the philosophy of forgive and forget, to me, has a problem. I want the people of India to forgive, but I do not want us to forget. I believe it is important for us to have a consciousness of what went on for 200 years, both to understand it for its own sake and to understand where we are, why we are where we are today. If today we have 26% poverty, we can certainly criticize Indian governments. But if you realize that we have come from 90% poverty, you might actually believe that some good has been accomplished. If today we are 69 as our life expectancy, you may say that is not good enough. China is 78. But if you realize we came from 27, perhaps you won't feel that it is so wrong. If you realize that our literacy rate is 72, that our women are 66.5, you may say, what a pity. Clearly, there's so much that our governments have not done to educate our people. But if you realize the numbers were 17 and 8.9, perhaps you may be a little more understanding. The challenge of India's development has been built on the ruins of what the British Empire did in India. Let's not forget that. But let us also remember our past glory in order to aspire to recreate that glory. Frankly, I don't think we're going to ever be in the imaginable future at 27% of the global's GDP. Again, that won't happen because the world has become more prosperous. Every country has grown into prosperity. But we can certainly rise above our present situation. We can certainly pull the remainder of our people out of poverty. And that is a challenge that I think gets intensified when you read about the past and understand where we've come from. Now, what exactly is the broad theme of the book? I'm hoping, of course, that you will read it, particularly those of you who have received copies today, and I believe there are more copies available outside at the back of the room. But the broad story is very simple. The British came in, they destroyed the existing industries of India. They destroyed a sophisticated society, a wealthy society of artisans, merchants, traders, warriors, and replaced it with their own rule. The country which was the leading exporter of textiles in the world was forced to become an importer of British textiles. Indeed, the Indian textiles were so good, were of such high quality, that there is material available in the literature of anecdotes of British shopkeepers in the 17th and 18th century trying to pass off shoddy European-made textiles as made in India, because made in India was a hallmark of quality and fetched a higher price. But the British came in unable to compete with these wonderful cottons, linens, muslins. Muslin so fine, it was said, it was fine, it was light as woven air. It was said that some of the Dhaka gauzes could be pulled through a ring. That's how fine they were. And what did the British do? They came in, they destroyed the looms of the weavers. They depopulated the great weaving towns of Dhaka and Murshidabad, whose populations actually dropped in the first years of British rule because they were attacking the looms and the weavers, destroying the industry. In one notorious incident, they cut off the thumbs of the weavers so they could not weave again. And since they controlled the ports, they imposed heavy duties and tariffs on India's exports, thereby destroying India's export markets, while reducing or eliminating duties and tariffs on their imports, thereby ensuring for themselves a captive market in India. A second example is shipbuilding. We were the leading country in the world in shipbuilding. The shipbuilders of Bengal, of Visakhapatnam and the Godavari Delta, and of the West Coast were of very, very high quality. In fact, our teak and mahogany woods were so durable and the craftsmanship was so high that our ships would last easily 25, 26 years on the high seas, whereas the average European ship, usually made of fir or pine, could only last 6 or 7 years. So when the British established themselves in India, they said, this is wonderful, let's make our ships in India. And the quality was so good, there were lots of writings admiring the quality of these Indian ships. But the result was that it started throwing people out of work in London. In the dockyards of London, shipwrights and craftsmen and fitters and so on became out of work. And so the British Parliament passed a law that made it impossible for ships made in India from plying on the lucrative international routes, particularly to London itself. And the result was, of course, the death of Indian shipping. Third example, steel. India had invented the finest steel in the world. It was called wrongly by the Europeans wood steel, W-O-O-T-Z, which looks as if it's a Polish or Czech word. But in fact, it was a corruption of the Kannada word ukka. It was called ukka steel, which was invented in what is today Karnataka. And this steel was of such high quality, the Arabs came and borrowed the technology to make their famous Damascus steel. And when the British came to India and engaged in their first battles, whenever they killed Indian soldiers, they would dismount from their horses and steal their swords, because the Indian soldiers' swords were made of such much better quality steel than anything available in Europe. That industry too was destroyed by the British, who imposed a British monopoly and imposed British standard steel specifications on the Indian market. So these are the kinds of examples of deindustrialization that I describe in more detail in the book, and what is more, the replacement of them by British goods. The second was the drainage of Indian resources. The British came quite directly to steal. They were in it for the money. They took the word, the Hindi word loot, into their dictionaries as well as their habits. And they proceeded to pillage the treasuries of all the principalities they conquered, even while marveling at their own self-restraint in not stealing more. Robert Clive wrote about how he could help himself to all the jewels, all the gold in every treasure chest, and that he could have actually stolen more. He was actually asking for praise that, having become one of the richest men in Europe by his theft in India, that he hadn't become even richer still. He bought a rotten borough for himself, became a member of parliament, and the British had the gall to call him Clive of India, as if he belonged to the country, when all he really had done was to ensure that much of the country's wealth belonged to him. Now, this was the kind of thing that went on. There was very severe taxation. Yes, we had our periods of bad taxation also, but for the most part, Indian taxation was much more reasonable, much less onerous than the British. Indian taxes were imposed with some humanity. So if the peasant had a death in the family, or there was a drought that year, or there was a daughter getting married, the tendency was to waive the tax or postpone the tax or reduce the tax. That humanity was completely absent in the British. When they took over, they exacted very high taxes, a minimum of 45% of the crop, sometimes going as much as 95% of the crop. And if people wouldn't pay, they were flogged, they were tortured, they were humiliated in public places in order to get them to pay. And all the proceeds of the taxes, at least the old Maharajas, would spend the bulk of the taxes in the country, building bridges and roads and culverts and serais and so on. The British would ship all the money off to England. And so it was not only an exaction of tax, it was the drainage of resources to England that was so iniquitous. Year after year after year, amounting to billions of pounds sterling taken away from India throughout the time of British rule. On top of that, their economic mismanagement of India was such that the growth rate of the Indian economy in the entire first half of the 20th century until 1947 was less than 0.01%. At the same time, the British got India to finance their work in the First World War. Not only the soldiers we sent, over 1 million Indians fought under arms, 1.3 million fought under arms for the British in the First World War, and 77,000 died for the British. But also, we sent food, we sent cash, we sent arms, we sent ammunition, we sent vehicles and carts, we sent pack animals. Even rail lines were ripped out of the ground and shipped off to aid the war effort. And the result is that in today's money, the Indian contribution to the British war effort was in the neighborhood of 800 billion pounds sterling. And this in a country that, thanks to British rule, was not growing economically. In fact, during the war, there was terrible inflation in India. We had the world's highest toll because of the worldwide influenza epidemic. 125 million Indians were infected. Terrible time. And yet we sent all these resources. That was the story. Now, obviously, there's much more detail in the book. I'm just giving you some examples for you to understand on the economic side. The creation of landlessness. We had so many travelers from the Arab world, from the Ottoman Empire, and from Europe coming to India in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries writing about it. No one describes poverty. No one describes landlessness. They constantly describe this amazingly rich country, full of prosperous people. You can't get so many different writers and travelers from so many different parts of the world at so many different periods to tell you the same quote-unquote PR. So clearly this was the truth. The British came in thanks to their policies of permanent settlement of land, the introduction of a zamindari system, their introduction, their replication of a kind of squirearchy, rather like they had in England. In India, they created landlessness. They deprived the poor farmer of his own land, reduced him to a tenant, and transformed, therefore, the nature of rural poverty in our country. There's a lot more that can be said, but let me turn the argument around for a minute. Some people say maybe all this is true. Oh wait, I did want to tell you a little more about famines before. I'll come back to this in a minute. Famines. I didn't see too many expressions of surprise when I said earlier that 35 million people died in famines for which I blamed the British. And some of you might have thought, why blame the British? A famine is an act of God. It is not. Droughts may be an act of God, but historically they were responses to droughts. They were welfare measures and charity carried out by the Maharajas, by the rich people of every village, every neighborhood. Nobody was allowed to starve to death. The British, however, came to India with three policy principles with regard to famines. First was the Adam Smith principle of the free market. You cannot interfere with the free market. If people can't afford to buy the grain, that because we are buying it and shipping it off to England, tough, let them die. Second principle, the Malthusian principle. Many of the students here will know the population theories of Malthus. Malthusian principle was that if the land cannot sustain the population that is trying to live off it, people must die so the natural population balance can be reasserted. And the third theory is very simple. Victorian fiscal prudence. Thou shalt not spend money thou hast not budgeted for. So with these three principles, the British refused to help during droughts. They did the same thing in Ireland, by the way, which is why in the 1840s, the Great Potato Blight, so many Irishmen died and so many got onto boats and migrated to America. That's why there are so many Irish people in America, because of British famine policy. But in India, we didn't have that option. We couldn't get on a boat and go to America, so we just died. And the British were utterly heartless in their policies. They would refuse to allow aid to be given. I've recounted an anecdote from the Erisa Famine of 1866, when a gentleman with the Irish-sounding name of Mr. McMinn was trying to help a poor person starving to death, and the British told him, if you don't stop doing this, we will send you back to the United Kingdom. You can't stay in India if you want to help people who are starving. Eventually, in the later part of the 19th century, there was an outcry against these policies. So very grudgingly, the British said, no, we will not allow charity, but we will create work camps. But these work camps were so awful that the rations given to people who had to work for those rations was lower than the Nazis were to give the inmates of the Buchenwald concentration camp during the Second World War. The Jews they were about to exterminate in the gas ovens. So that's the kind of horrible behavior. And as late as the Second World War, we had the Great Bengal Famine, in which 4.3 million Indians starved to death because of decisions deliberately taken by Winston Churchill. Churchill ordered that grain from Bengal should be shipped to Europe, not even just to aid the war effort, as was often said by the Brits, but to build up reserve stocks of grain in the event of a possible future invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. And for that purpose, Indians were allowed to starve to death, because obviously the purchases of all this grain and shipping it to Europe meant that what little grain remained became unaffordably priced for the poor man. And people were literally dying on the street. When conscience-stricken British officials wrote to London saying to the Prime Minister, Churchill, that his policies were killing such large numbers of people, all Churchill could bring himself to do was to write peevishly in the margin, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man whom the British want us to hail as an apostle of freedom and democracy. An absolute evil, racist murderer of innocent people. Now, this is when the apologists for the empire turn around and say, all right, these things happened, but think of all the good the British did. After all, they gave you the railways, they gave you the English language, they gave you rule of law, and so on. So what I've done in the second half of my book is I've taken each of these things, including the biggest claim of all, that Britain gave India political unity, and I have systematically demolished each of them by showing that every single thing they brought in, including tea and cricket, were brought in for their benefit to either enhance British profits or to facilitate British control over India. And I don't know how much time we have, but I should go into each of those stories, because the idea was also to have a question and answer exchange with you all, so that if some of you want to ask about these things in greater detail, we're happy to answer. But I'll just address a couple of them. Let's take the railways, because that's such a common example. Everyone says, shouldn't we be grateful to the British for the railways? Let me tell you, the railways were a great British colonial scam. They were brought into India for the principal purpose of extracting resources from the Indian heartland that were otherwise inaccessible by normal transport, and taking them to the ports to ship them to England. And the secondary purpose was to send troops into the restive interior of the country to put down any unrest. Those were the two purposes the British officially stated in order to justify the expenditure on the railways. Second, as usual with the British, they made a huge profit on the backs of the Indian taxpayer while building their railways. Investment in the Indian railways became the single most profitable investment any Englishman could make in the London Stock Exchange, with double the returns guaranteed of even government stocks and shares, bonds. So that the Indian taxpayer paid and the British investor profited. So much so there was no control on expenditure. They spent a fortune while building the railway, and each mile of railway in India cost 9 times the same mile in the US or Canada, which they were being built at the same time. Not only that, the railways were run in a very racist manner, in which they actually managed to ensure that pretty much every key position except the most menial, from station masters to ticket collectors, were Englishmen, right up to the First World War. And what they did was that even when Indians were eventually hired, they were paid lower wages than the white people. It really was only with independence that we were able to turn the purpose of the railways. Under the British, when these third-class railway carriages with their wooden slat benches were added for Indians to travel, the Indians paid the highest passenger rates in the world, whereas the British companies using the railways for freight paid the lowest freight rates in the world. It's only after independence we've gone to the other extreme, the opposite extreme, and we have given our passengers, our people, the lowest passenger rates in the world, and added routes catering to the demand for travel of Indian people, while raising the freight rates so high that now unfortunately it's become a bit uneconomical to ship freight on the railways, and our businesses are busy putting more and more lorries onto the congested highways of our country, thereby worsening our environment. So I hope we can find some sort of balance in our policy. But that shows you how much the policy was designed only to serve the British. when it comes to political unity, I point out that well before the British, Indians had manifested a yearning for political unity in India's own history. Going back to Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka, 3 centuries before the birth of Christ, who united most of the subcontinent as one country in one empire, to the Mughals, who did the same thing 1700 years later, and created a united India as well. So the British were merely doing what other rulers of India who were powerful enough were able to do. Because indeed the idea of Indian civilization was always of one land. The Bharat Varsh of the Rig Veda, this land between the Himalayas and the seas, was a common vision shared by everyone. Adi Shankara from Kerala, Shankaracharya, traveling the length and breadth of India and establishing his mutts in the south, in Kanchi, up in the north, in Srinagar, Kashmir, in Dwarka in the west, in the Jagannath and Puri in the east. All of those reflected an India of what the Harvard scholar Diana Eck calls the sacred geography of the country, knit together by countless tracks of pilgrimage. And if you think that's a purely Hindu idea, think again. Because Maulana Abul Kalam Azad has written about the idea of India as one place being shared by Muslims from other countries. So whenever an Indian went on the Hajj, whether he was a Pathan from the northwest or a Tamil from the southeast, he was described by the Arabs in the peninsula as Hindi. The assumption was there was one common people coming from Al-Hind. So that idea of one nation is not a gift of the British. But what the British did do was to destroy the political unity that Indians had yearned for over millennia by fomenting a policy of divide and rule after the mutiny, as they called it, the revolt of 1857, and consciously creating a sense of separation between Hindus and Muslims that culminated in the tragic partition of 1947. So if anything, the British can be credited with destroying India's political unity, not with creating it. And as for the rule of law, just to take a third example of their supposed benefits, I demonstrate in the book how the law was applied with excessive attention to the skin color of the defendant. So that in 200 years of British rule, you could only find 3 cases where Englishmen were convicted for murdering Indians. Whereas every year, hundreds of Indians were killed by English people, and there was no punishment or very modest punishment. In fact, one famous example is how so many Indian domestic servants were kicked to death by their British masters. But they were let off the hook on the grounds that Indians suffered from so much malaria that our spleens are enlarged, and so it wasn't the kick that killed the Indian, but the rupturing of his enlarged spleen. This is actually there in the literature. Punch magazine has even written an ode to the stout British boot, which was used to discipline the Indians. You can't speak of the rule of law in such a racist society, one in which only English judges could try Englishmen, and where the Indians who rose up the legal profession were humiliated and treated with great disrespect until the 20th century. I think I'm exhausting your patience, so I'm going to stop here, but these are all examples of what I've tried to do in the book. And at the end, I also speak a little bit about the messy afterlife of colonialism everywhere, looking to the lingering consequences here in the Arab world. It is no coincidence that ISIS-Daesh, in their original pronouncements, spoke about undoing the injustice of the Sykes-Picot line, drawn by the British and the French here. Now, it so happens that the states of the region believe that whether you like the colonialists or not, it would be too destabilizing to challenge the boundaries they drew, and so we must live with these boundaries. That's also the position in Africa. And of course, it's a position for us in India. We are living with the line drawn by Mr. Radcliffe in 1947. But at the same time, let us not forget how many lingering problems, right up to and including the Palestine tragedy, can be laid at the door of careless and racist colonialism. I'm going to stop there because I would like to take some questions and comments from all of you. This is a broad summary of my book, An Era of Darkness. The British publisher actually put in an even tougher title for the British edition. In Britain, this book is called Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. I think the title speaks for itself. I rest my case. Thank you.